Hello, welcome to Postcolonial Space. This is our fourth session on our course in postcolonial studies, and I'm delighted to be here. And I hope most of you who have been joining us regularly will join us today. And until now, we have discussed a brief introduction to postcolonialism by Robert Young, which of course you can still view. The edited version is available. And then we went and discussed R.F. Derlick's essay as a critique of postcolonial studies. And last week we did Anne McClintock's critique of postcolonialism. And today also Ella Shohat's critique of postcolonialism. And do keep in mind that these criticisms come in early 90s, 92, 91. And that's also when postcolonialism is emerging as a term in academic vocabulary, but also as a field of study. It is getting established in English departments. And in so many ways, it's a pretty fashionable term. And that it enters a deeply contested domain. And that is, it's not like, as Ella Shohat points out, it's not like it entered a vacuum. It's not like people weren't working on anti-colonialism or they weren't working on third world literature or the issues related to that. So it, in a way, enters a contested domain. And that is what we will talk about today. So as you join us, please do let me know that you're here. You can do that through the comments section, and so that I know that I'm not, just talking to an empty computer screen. And if you have any problems in hearing me or anything else, please do let me know. So I'll pause here and see how many of you have joined us, and then we'll start our conversation in a minute. So I'm checking my phone to see, if I can see your comments and stuff or not. But it's not showing me anyone at the moment. Did I get the date wrong or something? I don't know. Okay. All right. So I'll assume that, you all have joined us and you are listening to me. And so I'll go over briefly what her argument is. It's pretty much on the same lines as R.F. Derlick and in McClintock, but she's also questioning the term itself. So, she first puts the term post-colonial with a hyphen under discussion by suggesting that, what does it employ? And she is suggesting that it has a temporal connotation, but also a spatial connotation. And that's like a major part of her argument. In terms of temporality, what she's saying is that the post in the post-colonialism presupposes that colonialism is over. And there are certain ramifications of that, most of them positive. for the establishment of the field. And she gives us this anecdotal story of sitting on a committee where new programs or new courses were being proposed. And most university boards or university curriculum committees tend to be conservative, and they have to safeguard the interest of the institution. So if you propose something really radical, imperialism studies or studies of global capitalism and its implications for people, chances are those proposals won't go anywhere. But what she's saying is postcolonialism as a term kind of slips through because it is less threatening. And she has an argument there, because if you say, oh, we are going to initiate a course in postcolonial studies, no one is going to immediately feel threatened if they are an administrator, because they are going to assume that it's going to be what happens after colonialism, right? But if you say we're going to propose a course on neo-imperialism and the role of United States in it, chances are, people's feathers could get ruffled. So she finds that the field, the naming of the field as postcolonialism, kind of makes it into a less threatening concept. But then she also goes on to suggest that it's also kind of fashionable at that time. Now, remember, this essay came out in 91 because there are terms like post-feminism, post-industrialism, post-Fordism, post-modernism. All of those posts were emerging at that time. So this concept then itself also becomes one of those concepts. So let's stop here. Let me welcome those who I can see. So I see Infinita here. Thank you so much for joining us. And there are two other people listed here, but as you know, that there is a slight delay in the comments showing up on my screen. So I will, acknowledge your presence here as soon as I see your names. But thank you so much for joining me. So the first thing, going back to the Ella Shohat essay, is the very defanged nature of the term, because it's less threatening, right? And that it falls into the other posts that were emerging at that time, and it's a fashionable term. And the implication there is that postcolonialism, then as it emerges, is one of many posts that are emerging at that time, right? But then there is this way of thinking about postcolonialism after the hyphen is removed and it becomes one word, is it has an adjectival use, right? Postcolonial this, postcolonial that. People also then use it as a noun, postcoloniality, postcolonials, right? And that it becomes kind of a monolithic term to define all the people who were once colonized as living a postcolonial condition, living a postcolonial modernity. All of these terms become mobilized, which are kind of reductive, or if not reductive, positivistic, because they tend to assume that postcolonial world is one word. Now, remember, this essay came out in 1992, I think. So people are still trying to figure out what postcolonialism is. People who call themselves postcolonialism scholars are also still trying to figure out what it is. So then she also gives us this break in the term in terms of its temporal thinking and spatiality, right? And in terms of temporality, what she's then highlighting is, again, what the others have highlighted, that it puts all the nations that were at any time colonized into this one temporality, as if they all existed in the same time frame of being colonized. And in terms of spatiality, then all the spaces that were colonized are jumbled together under one register, right? And both of them are problematic. But as good scholars of any field of study, when you read debates like this, what my purpose in discussing these is that some of these arguments are still mobilized against postcolonialism and postcolonial studies. You'll be surprised to know that postcolonialism itself has become a kind of a threatening term. My hire in my department was not as scholar of postcolonial studies. It was as scholar of Anglophone English literature. I don't even know what it means. But so that was palatable to the departmental senior professors as well as administrators, because even postcolonial was kind of too radical for them, right? But also keep in mind that all three of these scholars, I think, whom we are discussing today, are relying on one work that claims to define postcolonialism in the early 90s, and that is Bill Ashcroft and others, The Empire Writes Back. And that book, in so many ways, had made huge generalizations, right? It didn't read the power structure of the globe, right? So for them, any country that had been colonized constitutes, their literature constitutes post-colonial literature. That includes Canada, that includes Australia and the United States, right? And they didn't make the distinction between the occupational colonialism and settler colonialism, right? So the idea of how the settlers came into United States, the European settlers, or Canada, and how they colonized the native populations falls by the wayside in that definition. Similarly, in Australia, the settlement of Australia and the destruction of the indigenous population can be kind of subsumed under Australia being post-colonial. And those are some of the things in spatial terms that she's pointing out, that post-colonialism, if it is taught as this monolithic concept, doesn't take into account, right? And that is the critique she's mounting. But do keep in mind, the critique is mounted to a certain conception of post-colonial studies in the book, The Empire Writes Back, right? No one in the post-colonial field of study now considers that. And if you read the earlier, accounts which post-colonial scholars have gone and recovered, like Albert Memmi's work, The Colonizer and the Colonized, already accounts for the settlers, right? And considers them a separate constituency, let's say, in French Algeria. They are not considered the oppressed or the colonized, right? Or purely European. They are a kind of like the petite bourgeois whose loyalties lie with France, right? So most post-colonial scholars have accounted for these subtleties, right? Whenever someone says I'm a post-colonialist today, they actually, know this to be the case, that we account for what the power structures is, what temporality to use. Most of the times we say, okay, we use 19th, 20th century colonialism. The reason we use it as a starting point or as a point of discussion is because it happens after rise of capitalism. And that's a different kind of colonialism. We also absolutely acknowledge that settler colonialism is actually a separate subject. We might encounter it, but we will never include the settler literature as post-colonial literature. Similarly, there have been efforts to retrieve indigenous works, right? And to also write about the internal colonizations within the post-colonial nation states, and to account for the conflicts that are happening amongst the post-colonial nations themselves. So one of the critiques also in this essay as well is that we used to have a powerful term, third world, right, which was political, right, which kind of brought about the idea of this third element to the first and second world structure of the global power. But by the time post-colonialism emerges, the third world itself had become a problematic term. And in so many ways, it had become a derogatory term. It had lost its revolutionary potential. So unlike R.F. Derrick, who still wanted us to claim the third world studies. I think by this time, third world, and after the fall of Soviet Union, there was not even a second world, right? So the idea of the third world and then a monolithic third world was always problematic, because so many of the so-called third world countries, even though they were part of the non-aligned movement, were belligerent nations, right? Like India and Pakistan, they had their conflicts amongst each other. Even now, they consider each other, enemies or whatever you want to call it. So even the third word as a monolithic term didn't carry the entire burden of the post-colonial geography, right? But these are some of the apt critiques, which, so what she questions is, when do we say post-colonialism started? What is it? How does it account for the internal colonialisms? How does it account for making everything post-structuralist and less political, right? And how does it account for connecting all third world histories to this inaugural moment of colonialism? These are all the critiques that are coming at this stage of the field. And I'll go in a minute into as to why it is important to know this. As someone who's studying post-colonialism, is becoming a scholar in it, but also, is just a student of it. Okay. So I see Anum here. Welcome, Anum. Thank you so much. So sadly, the comments on my phone are not showing. So usually the comments on my phone are faster than when they show up on my computer. So as soon as you show up, I know there are 8 people attending this meeting right now. So I hope you all will put your names in the comments so that I can, respond to you better. So going back to then this entire debate, the reason it is important for you as just a curious person or as a student and scholar of post-colonial studies to know these debates, and the reason I teach them and I incorporated them in this long-term online course on post-colonial studies, is because these critiques are still mounted. I mean, the typical critique of post-colonial studies from any corner is always that the person critiquing it makes post-colonialism into something, right? They reduce it to a certain specific definition, right? And then mount a critique of that. And then you as a practitioner and scholar has to come back and say, well, we're not just this. We're not just post-structuralists. We have Marxists, we have psychoanalysts, we have feminist scholars, right? Each one of us, and none of us claims to have a monolithic discourse on post-colonialism. Oh, cool, nice. So that's good. Because none of us can afford to claim a monolithic post-colonial discourse. So from my point of view, it depends on where you are, who you are, what your subjectivity is, what your politics is, which region do you want to specialize in. All post-colonialism does is it gives us certain central vocabularies which we can employ in different spatialities and temporalities, right? And that's what we should look for as students of post-colonialism. Now, that then troubles a lot of people, even my students, right? Because people always want precise definitions of concepts and fields of study. And I don't think so post-colonialism has or should have a very precise definition. I mean, that's why I use Robert Young's definition, because he says, okay, let's assume the experience of colonialism, but not necessarily as a beginning point, but as a disruptive moment, right? And we go beyond that in the past to retrieve histories before that, and we go what happens after that, and how did people resist, how did they write within it, how are they still responding to it, and how does that system still exist in so many different forms, right? And I think that's a better approach to understanding post-colonialism. I'm going to stop here and acknowledge who else has joined in. So Anum, you brought your better half to the meeting. Thank you. Love to see you here. Oves, thank you so much. Yeah, this is a kurta that I occasionally wear, and thank you so much for liking that. You know, people call it the national dress. So it's interesting, the politics of, national dresses. Okay, so now I think I've kind of exhausted the topic here. While you come up with any questions that you might have, I will say that I think we do need a textbook that kind of chronologically discusses the field, and I will see if I can copy certain chapters from different books and then have chronological discussions of the field itself by one author. Or what I can also do is develop, combine 3 or 4 post-colonial concepts and then have a meeting every week on those. The advantage of those would be that you can watch my previous videos on those concepts that already exist. You can read up on them, and then we can rehash them in our weekly meeting. So feel free to give me any suggestions even now or after this is over and I post it as an edited version. But that's what my plan is. Since this is going to be an ongoing project, we all learn together, and there is no semester system here. We don't have to cover certain things. So I think we can take our time and come together every week and then read it. Okay, yes, Anum, what is your question? Young's critique of Said. Yeah. Meanwhile, while Anum is asking her question, and by the way, Anum is reading for her comprehensive exams, so give her all the good luck you can. And so anyone else, if you have any other questions or suggestions, do let me know. And I would also thank you, Amina. Thank you so much for joining us. And I'll put your comment on the screen because I usually, we teachers are kind of greedy and we want to hear what our students think about it. So thank you so much. This is how my classes are also conducted. We always sit and sip our coffee and talk about theory and literature. And if Anum doesn't mind, I would like to let all of you know that Anum Aziz is my friend and my doctoral student, and she has finished her coursework and she's now preparing for her comprehensive exams. And she's one of my most brilliant students. And I'm proud to have her as my student and friend. So, okay, so meanwhile, please also know that by now on my channel, there are more than 350 videos. Even I'm surprised by it. And so, and people are using those materials. But what I'm saying is always, as we discuss these things, then the channel is called Postcolonialism. So there are so many resources there, and I would love for you to use them and then share them with others so that they can use them. I also want to apologize that you would have seen that in the last 2 or 3 days, and in the next weeks or so, a lot of my political commentaries will also start appearing on my channel. These were on a separate channel, but I just can't deal with two things at the same time. So I've moved them to this channel. So please bear in mind that I'm not giving up on my educational role, but I am a public scholar. And so if you don't like them, just don't watch them. But those are my public commentaries about politics in United States and Pakistan, which is my native country. And I thought I need to have a public space to share, my political self. Postcolonialism is a deeply political field anyway. Uh, so good. That's your job, to keep Anam fed as she, studies for her exams. And okay, Israr. Good. So Israr says that I just took my master's exam and your lectures help. Oh, I'm so delighted to know that. Um, I'm so glad because, to be very honest, the where United States is these days, right? A lot of us who do this kind of work, we feel deeply isolated at work, in the general culture. I mean, I'm lucky because I have a wonderful partner and we have a beautiful life together. But the general culture is kind of deeply pessimistic. And then there is COVID-19 and we can't see our friends or hang out with them. So getting, response, any response on the videos or anything, or in this forum from you, it's deeply gratifying, but it also is encouraging, and it gives me, strength. And thank you so much for saying that. I'm so delighted that people are fighting. Uh, okay, so going back to Anum's question, he says that Said uses Foucault's discourse not in the way Foucault uses it himself. How does Said's Orientalism in this light appear as a theoretical analytic system of colonialism? Um, and thank Good. Okay, so the reason, I always felt that um, about Said's use of discourse, and I will say why. Now, one aspect of Foucault's use of discourse is Foucault doesn't just account for how does a discourse create its object of studies, right? Since power is moving through the discourse, he also then accounts for the resistances that emerge. Now remember, the concept of power in Foucault is that power is productive, right? While power and knowledge come together to create objects of study and human subjectivities, right? They also create their own resistances. Now, there is a whole lecture series that I'm doing on Orientalism, and this will become a topic. There is what Said is so, and remember, Said was the first major scholar in United States to actually use Foucault. The books had just come out 2 or 3 years ago. So we can give him the credit for that. But one of the biggest critiques of Said is that in Orientalism, the Orientals are absolutely sort of represented as a construct of Europe or a construct of European discourse. And that was so acutely felt by so many scholars that Said actually added an afterword to the later edition of the book that I teach. And in that, his argument is, look, it wasn't my project to offer what the natives felt in terms of resistance. What did they do? How did they mobilize it? Because my project was to point out how the Europeans construct the Orient in their works, in their imagination. But that critique is apt, because if you are going to use discourse to understand a part of history and culture, you cannot just read what the discourse does and how does it create its objects of study. You also have to account for certain material conditions, right, that make the discourse possible. But also, how do people create their counter discourses? And I think that's the account that is missing. But to give credit to Said, when you read someone like Said or Foucault or Chomsky, you can't just base your opinion on one work. You have to read their entire oeuvre, right? Until the end of their days, right? The last book, to kind of figure out how is the trajectory of their work, right? And you will see that Cultural Imperialism, already a book is that is telling the other side of the story, what the Orientals themselves were doing, how were they representing themselves, right? You, me, Anum, and all those people from the periphery, when we pick up a theoretical concept from our own cultures, from our own histories, right? I remember that my forthcoming book, I was looking for a certain way of why is it that when a established discourse is challenged, right, not totally but one precept of it, right, that it goes into crisis and people come after you, right? Any established system, power structure, when you why are they so sensitive to these minor criticisms, right? And of all the places I found it in, I think, volume 3 of Ibn Khaldun's Muqaddimah, or 2, where he's explaining, or maybe it was Al-Ghazali, I'm missing my scholars, where he says that the reason the response is so swift and so aggressive from any established discourse is when you chip at their basic structures, is because so much of what they have built, right, relies on those basic foundational structures. So when you threaten the integrity of that, the system responds to you, the power structures, because they know that if that little thing is disrupted, this entire edifice that they have built will collapse, right? And so why I'm trying to say that is that then you, me, and others go into our own historical philosophical traditions, pick up a concept from there, and use it as we're writing a book in English, maybe about American literature and whatever. And that's how you infuse the Western theory, you know, with knowledges that are on the global periphery. Said does that in The World, the Text, the Critic. Actually, the book is sitting right here because I was rereading it. He goes and picks up these two schools of grammarians, right? The Zahiriya and Batiniya from Al-Andalus, from from Spain. Infinita is from Spain. I don't know from which part. And these grammarians and their debates about how do the words mean in a sacred text. Do they mean, how do we construe meanings? Is there a hidden meaning in the text? That is the Batiniya way of looking at it. Then you go into the word etymologies. Or can we read the words in context, know a little bit of their history, but what could they mean now, right? Two different modes of thought. And he puts them in the beginning chapter of his book, giving me and so many other Western scholars this knowledge from elsewhere that could inform their acts of reading. So that's what also Said does and has done over his career. And we can do too as post-colonialism scholars. Okay, so I get this question a lot. How can we relate Said's Orientalism to Daryl Walcott's poem, A Far Cry from Africa? I've not read the poem, but I can extrapolate. And I have a whole video on how to use theory to write a paper. You can mold it, how to use theory to write an answer to a question. You never use Orientalism. You never use Edward Said. If it's a 20-page paper for a class, you don't have room to actually use Orientalism as a concept. You go to a specific place in the book where Said tells you this is how to read a text. You take that as your launch off point. On page 52 of Orientalism, Said says that if you're reading and I'm making this up, if you're reading the figure of the woman, in such and such novel, this is an Orientalist way of representing it, and this is how we should read it. You take that example, and then you explain why you are going to use that to read this poem or any other poem. and you argue for it. Why is it that I'm using this theory? That is part of your argument. You always justify your theory. And then you can use any scholar to do anything. So, okay, that was my. So, which is your favorite soccer team? If you're from Madrid. Okay. So, uh, but this question, I get this a lot. Like people would tell me, can you show me how I can apply this theory to this short story? The short answer is there is, you know, you just read a theorist or a particular work from them. And when you are using them to unpack a text, in your introduction, tell us who you're using and why and how, right? Explain how are you reading that particular passage of Fanon or Said, right? And then why is it useful to use that and not anything else to read a text or to write about it? Train yourself about this, but also please do watch. I have a couple of videos that discuss how to use, literary theory to write a paper, how to use theory simply. And I have a whole webinar, I think 1 hour on scholarly writing, which discusses these issues. So please also watch those, right? But good question. All right. So we're missing some of our regulars today. Oroko hasn't joined us, and then quite a few friends from India are not here. And the funny thing about my Pakistani friends uh, is that they all insist that I should record most of my lectures in Urdu and do this and that, but then they don't show up, nor do they watch my videos, even when I record them in Urdu, which is interesting. But the reason I can't record everything in Urdu is that, the audience is international, and I need to take care of them. Cool. So yeah, Amana, do watch that video. And then if you have any questions, just post a comment under that video and I will certainly respond to that. So humanistic. Okay. Now remember, to understand why someone is critiqued for being humanistic, you have to understand that is the hardest thing that Said has to reconcile, his humanism with Foucault. Okay, whatever Foucault theorizes in his work is what the discourse of anti-humanism is built on. Now, what is anti-humanism? Anti-humanism is not that we hate human beings. What it basically says is it dispels this idea that we are autonomous, independent, individual human beings with a core and ideas. That idea is destabilized by this idea of being a subject, which is constituted by discourses. Most of the time outside of it, that is what we call the decentered subject. And it says humanism, how do you reconcile, how do you use discourse, but still believe in this certain kind of idealized humanism? And you will see in his last book, Said's last book, Democratic Criticism, right? Its subtitle is some kind of humanism. I have the book on my shelf. So Said goes back to his humanism. He remains a humanist throughout his life as a scholar. A humanist in two senses. A humanist because he's a scholar of humanity. That's what we also call a humanist. But a humanist also in terms of asserting constantly that despite all the erosions of the centered human subject, we need to hang on to certain values of reason, certain values of human, identity and its performance in the world. And he does that against the grain of post-structuralist thought or even Marxist thought. And so he's often criticized for that. What was the first part of the question? What was the... Okay, so I don't know. Anam, has I answered that? That's a really good question. I don't think so. I'm prepared for it because I haven't read all of my Jean-Paul Sartre. So how is it different from Marx himself? Marx himself is deeply humanistic. Okay, so Marx's humanism. A good critique of Marx's humanism is here in Franco Berardi's The Soul at Work, which I have started recording some lectures on. So Marx's humanism, how do we find out that he was deeply humanistic? Is if you look at his idea of class consciousness, alienation and disalienation. When you look at alienation labor, right, in Marx, especially in early Marx, but also I think in late Marx, the idea of alienation is that labor, the worker, is alienated from what or he or she is naturally meant to do, right? So what is an example? Okay, you, Anum, are trying to get a PhD in postcolonial studies because you love to teach. That is what you would like to do. But you have to go and get a job at a gas station. You have to go and, make shoes. You have to go and become a seamstress to pay your way through education. So that means your vocation is this that you want to do, but you have to make a living to feed yourself. So you're doing work that you are not meant to do, not invested in. So that makes you alienated labor because you are not aligned with what you're doing. So the purpose was, how do you create a disalienated worker? You reconcile the worker with what they were naturally meant to do. The moment you say that, you're acknowledging that there is something naturally human, that something that I need to reconcile my material self to. That is Marx's humanism, right? Now, Sartre, what I understand is for him, we exist in the material world, right? And that is why it is called existentialism, because the experiences of the existing world in which we exist construct who we are, right? And in order to change me, myself, I must change the existential situation within which I live, right? Sartre himself is a Marxist, but taking the alienation towards a different direction. But that is just a part answer to that. Um, I must admit I am not absolutely prepared to like really philosophically answer that question about the Sartre part. About Marx, yeah, I'm clear. Yes. So okay, good. All right. Okay, so yeah, this is turning out to be a really good conversation. And Abbas says that I love postcolonial studies. Thank you for saying that. But do keep in mind, never reduce it to a binary structure of us versus them. The beauty of postcolonial studies always is that it is open to new knowledges. It can appropriate them, and it doesn't really care where the knowledge comes from. There is no pure knowledge, there is no pure retrieval. And that's what I absolutely believe in. Okay. Okay, I have a Shibu. How can we establish biopolitics in post, if you please? Well, that's a very good question, and maybe we'll do a lecture on it. Biopolitics is already part of postcolonial studies. People have used it in their dissertations, in books. The way we use it is even Foucault, or if you want to go by Roberto Esposito, uh, uh, you just, what is biopolitics? Power coming together to shape human bodies, right? and it is like highly theorized later in Foucault's History of Sexuality, part 1, 2, and 3. And then Roberto Esposito has a beautiful rereading of biopolitics. So what is biopolitics? That the government, instead of suggesting that I am an institution of death and I will punish you, starts claiming this idea that the role of the government is to make more life possible, right? That role that government takes, which Foucault theorizes as governmentality, you can take those concepts and then apply in any post-colonial situation. What kind of biopolitics, when the fundamentalists in Pakistan tell women that they should not work and just produce babies, what kind of biopolitics is operative there? Because they are saying you are sacred vessels, your job is to create more little Muslims so that we can people the world. If you just do your job, we will have a larger, more prominent Muslim population. That's biopolitics at play, mobilizing women's bodies for the future of a religion or a country, right? Being offered by someone who has power, who has knowledge, right? Or anyone claiming that if I put a lot of you, the Chinese claiming that they put a lot of millions of people in concentration camps, how is it not politics of death? How is it not necropolitics, right? It's biopolitics, because like, no, we're not killing them. These are not the death camps, right? We are re-educating them to integrate them into the larger economy. That's biopolitics, right? An argument of an oppressive system like that in the name of better life, in the name of life. So I say, read Foucault, read Agamben, and especially Homo Sacer and his discussion of bios and Zoe, and then read Roberto Esposito for a reading of theirs, and then you'll have a better understanding of biopolitics. Sorry, you guys are asking me deeply philosophical questions, and I feel I'm not prepared for that. Okay, Infinita. Is it not also that alienation relates to the good, thank you, I had missed that. The repetitive and automatized work, which in some sense it makes human beings kind of automatas, depriving them from their human. Absolutely, yes, I had missed that point. So one, you're doing something that you're not meant to do, and two is that you're doing repetitive actions that you have no emotional investment in. So the purpose of revolution is, or to create disalienated labor, is to remove that and then reconcile them with something that they enjoy doing. Because deep down in Marx, human beings are homo faber. We are productive animals, right? That's the presumption. And that is also the humanism of Marx. Right? Thank you so much, Infinita. Okay, Abbas, I want to write a research paper on postcolonialism. Sorry, I can't suggest any topics because I don't know what your class level is, what kind of paper is it. The best way to write a postcolonial paper is know what level you are writing. If it's in the literature field, find what novel do you want to write about. Then postcolonialism is a huge field of study, so choose which particular part of postcolonial studies would you like to be using. If you're going to use postcolonial feminism theory, which one? Will you go to Leila Abu Lughad? Will you go to Chandra Mohanty? Which part of that book? So that is a very hard question for me to answer. And the second thing is that kind of micro help, only your immediate professors can give you that, because they know which level you are on. They know what their expectations is. Now, if you want to know how to use postcolonial theory, just watch my brief lecture on how to use theory to write a paper. Now, you can replace that theory part with any theory that you want to use, but it will explain to you the basic structure of a graduate level good paper, right? I have no idea what paracolonialism is, Wes. Do you think countries like Pakistan is not I don't know whether Pakistan is para-colonial. I do know it's a fact of history, even if you go by a temporal marker, that Pakistan is a post-colonial nation. I don't know what a para-colonial nation is, because the term would imply that the country somehow like escaped the impact of colonialism. Uh, I have no idea what para-colonialism is. I'm sorry, I'll look it up, but I've never encountered that term. Uh, okay. Thank you, Infinita. Thank you so much for your wonderfully apt point. Um, I am not going to do that. I'm not going to summarize dialectical materialism here, because that's a topic of an entire new debate. But basically, what is dialectical materialism in opposition to ideological dialectics, right? So if you look at Hegel, right, the dialectic is ideological because there is one concept, which you call thesis. It goes and seeks its antithesis, right? Then it subsumes part of that antithesis and makes a synthesis. And the process goes on and on until you reach the absolute spirit, right? That was the idea of how to reach the absolute spirit through reason, right? Dialectical materialism, just instead of using ideas, basically is telling you, look at the material conditions here, right? What mode of production exists over here? This mode of production will create this kind of consciousness, right? Then, as the mode of, since this consciousness is at work, it will end up changing the mode of production. When a new mode of production emerges, a new mode of consciousness, class consciousness, will emerge. So dialectical materialism is always initiated by material changes in the mode of production and not because of the ideas. So that is roughly the difference between dialectics in Hegel and dialectical materialism in Marx. Now, a lot of people assume that dialectical materialism is automatic and constantly keeps happening, right? And has a teleology. In Marx, that idea kind of comes that it is probably automatic and has a natural telos. If you read your Freire carefully enough or watch my lectures on it, you know that nothing happens by itself. And especially revolutionary change is not teleological. Dialectical materialism is not going to happen by itself unless there is reflection and praxis involved, which combined together is a revolutionary act, right? So there are huge debates on it. So maybe someday I will choose it as a topic by itself, and maybe I'll be able to do some justice to it. So that's a good question. If say something on Foucauldian resistance, I will, but not today, because I don't think so. I'm prepared for it. In order to answer that question, I have to go reread certain important parts of Foucault, and then go and reread some people in postcolonial studies who might have theorized it, and then answer that question. So that already tells you, you never know all the answers. You always have to. Again, Abbas, there are no main concepts of postcolonial feminism. That's what I'm trying to train you not to do, to reduce a field to simple concepts. Any concept of feminism, gender, rights of women, can be made post-colonial. All you have to do is take away its Eurocentricity and make it particular to any class of women anywhere. The concept of the subaltern, as theorized by Spivak, absolutely deals with the urban lumpen proletariat, right? Now, the best book where post-colonialism is theorized and mainstream Western post-colonialism is challenged from a deeply philosophical perspective is Chandra Mohanty's Under Western Eyes. So if you read that, then you will not only know what are the major debates that she brings around in the field of Indian context, but mostly post-colonial developing world, third world feminism, in opposition to the main claims of Western feminism. But even when I invoke the term Western feminism, I have to qualify it. Which feminism am I talking about? First wave, second wave, third wave, fourth wave feminism. Within that, is it the French feminism or American gynocritics? There is no single feminism, right? So in order to theorize post-colonial concepts, you can pick up anything. You can pick up anyone, any scholar, Judith Butler, or the early feminist scholars, and then you see what part of it applies in a post-colonial situation for women, and what part of it is too Eurocentric or too bourgeois, and you don't want to use it or you want to modify it. That's how you change a theory. I do get these questions a lot from India and Pakistan, where people want precise definitions and reductive answers. But sadly, I mean, that's the worst thing you can do as a scholar. Now, I know that the educational systems are such, even not just like college and school. I mean, the so-called Central Superior Civil Services of Pakistan, anyone who can pass that exam thinks that they are like better than anyone else. They also want these kind of canned responses. But I can promise you, if you read literary theory and post-colonial theory for 5 years, 2 hours a day, you will do better on any exam than all these people who go and cram and study and pay a lot of money to become what DSP or a deputy commissioner, which is also our colonial heritage. This entire power structure of civil servants, not necessarily accountable to people, of course, who left us that, the British. Okay. Good questions, though. Thank you. Let's see. Oh, welcome back, Chandrasekhar. Does postcolonialism origins from subaltern? Uh, okay, so it doesn't originate from subaltern studies, but it learns a lot from subaltern studies. Now, Spivak herself would tell you, because sometimes people try to attribute subaltern studies to her, and she is like, no, people in India were doing this long before I wrote the essay, Can the Subaltern Speak? Now, postcolonialism didn't initiate there, but it absolutely relies on a lot of work that the subaltern studies scholars have done. Now, do keep in mind that the subaltern studies, like people like Ranajit Guha and others, they themselves came under a lot of critique after volume 5, because they increasingly kind of expanded from their Marxist origins, right, to becoming post-structuralist. And then a lot of people like, what's that guy's name, Chibber and others, they kind of make subaltern studies itself into post-colonial studies, because then they can prove, oh, this is what is wrong with that. We all know when we read the subaltern studies, the problematics of subaltern studies, because here are scholars saying we are going to go retrieve the subaltern texts, but these are bourgeois middle class scholars. That problem will always be there. The question is, are we better off if the bourgeois scholars go and talk to the communities, talk to the peoples, find their histories and record them? Or do we just sit down and say, I have no right to record these histories, and wait until the subaltern can speak for herself? And Spivak would tell you, no, we cannot do that. Okay, we must make at least a terrible but imperfect attempt at speaking in solidarity with the subalterns, in representing them to the world politically, culturally. And so in that sense, postcolonial studies, owes a lot to subaltern studies collective, and just the general subaltern studies. And that's why I constantly push my Pakistani scholar friends, right? If you have the misfortune of watching one of my political videos on the channel, there is one about the curtailment of the public sphere and intellectual culture in Pakistan, because there is no corresponding subaltern studies project in Pakistan, not at any university, Okay, there are public scholars who have done that, like uh, people like Sobo Gyan Chandani and other Marxists from Sindh who have written wonderful, wonderful histories, subaltern histories from Sindh. But generally speaking, in Pakistani academy, um, there is no corresponding body of work that claims here is the national narrative, but here is the narrative that has been erased by national narrative. Chances are, if you try to do that, you'll get in trouble. Uh, Yeah, history never spoken from the grassroots. Well, the thing is, it is spoken, but the question is who appropriates it and in whose name, right? So there is a concept that comes to us from South America, which is called testimonio, right? Now, a testimonio is when a Western scholar or your own bourgeois scholar goes to a native community, interior or wherever, learns from them their histories and their stories, and then writes it from their own point of view, okay, in their own vocabularies. Now, the chances are we can either dismiss it as an urban intrusion or as a bourgeois intrusion into the stories of the subalterns, right? But the very nature of being in a subaltern group is that you don't have access to a political voice, right? So if you are going to be a scholar, are you going to be a purist and keep repeating the subaltern cannot represent herself? I don't want to risk to speak in solidarity with the subaltern because I can never capture the voice of the subaltern. Or you're going to say, okay, I'm going to get my hands dirty. I'm going to go to this constituency in solidarity with them, learn from them, and then, with their permission, offer their grievances or knowledge to the powers that be. I think that one is more politically uh, positive and can have an impact where we learn. Think of it this way. Yeah, Mr. Chibber. Yeah. Okay. Think of it this way. If you look at the history of Dalit rights in India, okay, now they'd always agitated for their rights, right? Now, Ambedkar comes to Columbia, gets his PhD, right? Goes back to India and makes it his lifetime work, right? As a Dalit leader, right? To record his or her experiences, right? And then to fight for those rights. He could have just stayed in Colombia and say, I've become a bourgeois intellectual. I can't represent my community anymore. But no, he took the risk of going back and saying, I will try to represent my community and its grievances, and look at the legacy that he has left us, right? So the choice is always ours, is whether we want to do the work with the subaltern communities with their permission or not, right? Now, the worst thing is where you sit in your university office and use, like, I am going to write about the rights of women in a village called Khaplu, in Baltistan, right? And I have read 7 books on it, but never really touched Khaplu, been there, sat with the people, seen their life. Now, that would be the worst kind of scholarship. Now, you can sign a letter saying the rights of people over there must be protected. That is still kind of impractical bourgeois activism. But the worst is if you don't do that. I mean, you can at least add your voice to it. Okay, good question. But isn't post-structuralism not really purely Western? No. I mean, it's not Western. Similarly, post-colonialism itself is not purely Western. The question for that is, what is Western? Culturally, socially, politically, economically, right? Western, in my sense, would be where you center all the Western sensibilities and universalize them, and then say this is what the truth is, right? My approach has always been, I don't care where the knowledge comes from. If it is liberatory, if it makes people's lives better, if it helps, gives them the tools to fight oppression anywhere in the world, right? Marx is Western, right? How many leftist parties are there in the developing world, right? So the question isn't whether something is purely Western or not. The question is whether it is Western centric, right? Is it Eurocentric? That's what we need to guide against. So if we are offering a certain thing, let's say in feminism, as an absolute universal of feminism, that's where people like Chandra Mohanty and others come and say, well, there are different ways of thinking womanhood. In Africa, they have called womanism. In the Muslim world, there are different kinds of critiques, different ways of gender identity. So not all universals can be carried through. But if they are liberating and you can nativize them to create a better world, why not? I mean, I always argue that, the post-colonial nations that Ella Shohat talks about, who are at war with each other and have internal conflicts, all of these people have no qualms about using the so-called destructive technologies of the West, right? The only problem happens when someone says, well, there are a couple of liberating ideas, maybe we can use them, and then they become the Western ideas, right? And they're contaminated. And this whole idea anywhere in the world where people think one system can answer their questions, one religion can make the life better. No, the world is too complicated. So does imperialism still exist? Yeah, I think so. I mean, global imperialism still exists because there is a dominant part of the world which owns pretty much the whole mode of production. And then there are always internal imperialisms, right? Where the dominant majoritarian group either tries to dictate the lives of the minorities, or even in the household, the imperial nature of the patriarchy, not even just officially or legally, but unofficially. Imperialism will exist in your culture if a woman walks out on the street and doesn't feel safe from the male gaze. That is the imperial nature of patriarchy and the male gaze, right? But it has to be systematic or systemic, and you can see that how it operates globally, but also how it operates, in the native post-colonial nation states. All right, so we are at 1 hour. And I also have to teach my undergraduate class after this. Uh, so I think we can conclude it here, and then I will come up with a new topic for the next week. And I hope we can continue these conversations. And if you have any suggestions when I post the edited version of this, please do put those suggestions in the comments so that it helps me think through these things. But I think I'm going to end it here, and I'm going to say my thanks and thank yous, and thank you all for joining me today. And I hope you will also join me next week. And then I'll pause for any last minute questions or concerns. If no, then I would say what I always say, right? What do I say? Peace and love.